So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest presenter. Tom Chapman has been the executive director of the Iowa Catholic Conference since 2007. So I believe he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about our topic today, which is faithful citizenship for Iowa Catholics. So Tom?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. As we go forth today, I'm going to have a PowerPoint that I'm going to attempt to share with you, and also a short video in a little bit as well. But so at this point, I will try to put the PowerPoint up on the screen. And here we go. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay. Well, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here today. The Iowa Catholic Conference is the public policy and lobbying agency for the Catholic bishops of Iowa. So I work for the 4 bishops of Iowa, so please pray for me, first of all. During the legislative session, I'm up at the Capitol pretty much every day, working on the social justice and respect life agendas of the church and Catholic schools. And so another part of my job, which I spend a lot of time in the fall, is to help people inform their conscience and take action in the political arena. And that includes encouraging people to vote. So one of the lucky things about us is we get to talk about religion and politics all the time. One thing we don't do is support or oppose candidates for office. So we don't get involved in that at all. Today, I'm going to cover the basics of forming your conscience in light of some principles that are important to our Catholic faith. And as we do that, I'll be asking you to put aside your political party and put on your identity as a Catholic and as a member of the body of Christ. So we're going to talk today as Catholics, not Democrats or Republicans. And I'm certainly happy to take any questions that you have, as we go along here. Now, I know that these days are not easy for people. We've got the pandemic going on. There's instances of overt racism, violence in the streets. I know that many of you are suffering from economic disruption and assaults to mental, if not physical health. We can take comfort in knowing that Jesus is with us. And I try to take the advice of Paul. Rejoice in hope, endure in affliction, persevere in prayer. And so that's something we can hang on to. And certainly if you need help personally, you shouldn't hesitate to contact your parish or your nearest Catholic Charities office as well. In their document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, the U.S. bishops say that participation in political life is a moral obligation. And that comes from Scripture, where basically we have 2 responsibilities: to love God and to love our neighbor. Everything depends on this. As Catholics, we receive the Word in the body of Christ, and then we're supposed to go out and live as Eucharist in the world. And this is not optional. If we are to do justice, part of that is going to have to be in the political arena. And so at this point, I'd like to show you a short video from the Catholic bishops that's entitled "Catholics Participate in Public Life."
As Catholics, how are we called to engage? How can we live out our faith in and out of the voting booth?
As followers of Christ, we are called to participate in public life.
It's about voting and getting involved in our communities, serving those in need and advocating.
There are many ways we are invited to work with Christ as he builds his kingdom.
The Church's obligation to participate in shaping the moral character of society is a requirement of our faith. It is a basic part of the mission we have received from Jesus Christ. We work to protect both the unborn and families in poverty. We advocate for the dignity of immigrants in need of welcome, to put an end to racism, and to protect the religious freedom of all. We are not aligned with any party, but we shine the light of our faith to influence parties to which we may belong, as well as our elected officials and those in our communities.
As Catholics, we must also imitate Christ's love and compassion by modeling civility where we live, work, and worship, through seeking to understand, through treating others with respect, and engaging with them, even when we disagree, and by approaching conversations with love and charity. Together, we can be witnesses of faithful citizenship.
Merciful Father,
thank you for inviting each of us to join in your work of building the kingdom of love, justice, and peace.
Help us to value all whom you love, those not yet born,
those in poverty,
those in need of welcome.
Guide us to imitate your charity and compassion.
and to serve as models of loving dialogue.
Amen.
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 So how can we best enter into the debate in our politically polarized world? You know, one thing that might help us build a culture of encounter with others is to practice civility, because we have so many Catholics all over the political spectrum. I think we are one of the institutions in this country that's well positioned to bridge that gap of divisiveness. To help with this, the bishops have launched, as you can see behind me, a CIVILIZE It campaign. The purpose is to invite Catholics to model civility, love for neighbor, and respectful dialogue. There are basically three elements to the campaign. One is civility, and this is where we want to make sure that we recognize others' human dignity and treat others with respect. We also want to talk about clarity.
This is that CIVILIZE It thing.
We stand up for our convictions while seeking to understand others. And we try to root our viewpoints in the gospel and a well-formed conscience. And so CIVILIZE It does not mean we go stand in a corner and don't enter the dialogue. That's what the clarity part is about. And then, of course, we also want to be compassionate. We want to presume others' best intentions and listen with empathy. Strive to understand others. And as Christians, you know, we should rather be criticized for too much charity rather than too little. The language that we use is important. And as you see here on the screen, you can make the pledge yourself at the bishop's website, which is wearesaltandlight.org. wearesaltandlight.org. Now, the bishops see their role in politics as helping point out our political choices in light of our faith, so we can form our conscience and make decisions about how to get involved. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of how we might make those decisions as a part of our prayer life. Conscience is not just about how we feel, but it's about what God is calling us to be and do. And I think the first principle is that we have to approach any decision to be made with an openness to the truth and what is right. We must have a desire to say yes to God, not yes, but. Not looking for a path to just supporting our team. And we might have to put aside our initial inclinations. And this is very difficult for us to do. It's certainly difficult for me to do. You know, we want to study what scripture and church teaching is on the subject. And there are so many resources, obviously, sacred scripture, the Bishops' Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship document, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. Those are all very key sources. We should also examine the facts and background information from a variety of sources. Please don't rely on political party talking points or just your favorite news sources inside your bubble. I mean, that's one of the things about social media that we have to watch for, is that it starts to create a bubble around us where we're only hearing things from a certain perspective. You know, sometimes those things might make us feel good, they might make us feel mad, but it's only from that perspective. And we have to be careful about that. At best, those political party talking points are incomplete. We can also learn from the practical experience that we find in our parishes, helping the poor and vulnerable, or once again from Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services, and other ministries of the church. That can provide us with a lot of background information. Then we want to enter a time of prayerful discernment about the will of God. As the church sees it, conscience is not just a feeling about what to do or not to do, but it's the voice of God resounding in the human heart. And so to hear that voice, we really need to listen. Maybe even sit for 5 minutes in stillness. That is really hard to do. And I've tried it, and I continue to try it sometimes. Usually what happens after about 2 minutes is I'm wondering where the potato chips are or something like that. But it's important for us to pay attention to what God is calling us to be and do. And to do that, we have to listen. And it's not easy, but we should try it. And then finally, we want to make a prudential judgment and then actually take action. So we don't want to keep this in our own heads, but we want to figure out what we need to do and then go take action. So at this point, you may want to take note of this reflection question for later. What do I do regularly to form my conscience? Just one little thing I do is I get the daily scriptures sent to me from the usccb.org website. That's helpful for me, helps kind of put my day in context. There's a lot of other things that you may be able to do as well. I want to share with you some thoughts on voting from the perspective of the Catholic bishops in Iowa. And I know Bishop Sinkula can jump in at any time if you'd like to do that. Each election cycle is a little different. It has unique characteristics, and this year is no exception. From the bishop's perspective, there are a few things and a few maybe even hazards that we might have to look at this year. And one, of course, is the threat of the coronavirus pandemic. Many people live in fear for their lives and of their livelihoods because of the threat of the disease. And so we need elected officials that will act out of concern for public health in order to ensure the safety of the workforce and students in schools. There are, of course, threats to life. There are forces that threaten the unborn with abortion, prisoners with the death penalty coming back at the federal level, or the aged and terminally ill with doctor-prescribed suicide. We need elected officials who are going to be guided by science to recognize as a human person the child in the womb, the elderly person in a sickbed, and all others respecting the sacredness and dignity of all human life. There are threats to human rights and the common good. There are threats of people being denied their rights as well as their access to benefits or protection simply because of their gender, color, country of origin, religion, or whatever. We need to watch out for those threats. And then, of course, there are threats to immigrants. DACA recipients in particular live in fear of deportation from the only home that they've really ever known. Their parents and others live in the same fear about having to return to the threat of gang violence, oppressive governments, or poverty. So we need elected officials that are going to stop talking and start doing something about reforming our outdated immigration system in order to accommodate these people who came here for work to feed, clothe, and house their families. And then finally, there is the threat to our democratic process from people like us who are eligible to vote and able to vote, but don't exercise that right and duty in a conscientious way. So it's on us if we don't vote. As I mentioned before, the bishops won't tell you who to vote for. The church does not support or oppose candidates for office or political parties. Rather, as the bishops say in their national document, voting is a decision to be made by each Catholic, guided by a conscience, formed by Catholic moral teaching. And I think that each of those words is very important. This process of deciding how to vote may not be easy, and it may lead us to a place we don't want to go. But it's our responsibility to listen to God in our heart and pray for wisdom. That's what discernment is about. And then, of course, you actually have to follow through and vote. The first step is registering to vote. And Iowa actually has a very high registration rate, which is good. There's a lot of information in terms of background on how to vote and the procedure at the website from the Secretary of State's office. This first website is voterready.iowa.gov. I would encourage you to take a look at that. You can find out if you're registered to vote online, through this website and the link to the click the link to the Secretary of State's website. You can also find additional information about where to vote and how to vote through mail. You really do need to be thinking about your options this year, about how you would prefer to vote, whether absentee, through the mail or at the polls. Every voter, if you haven't already, is going to receive an application to request an absentee ballot, although the ballots themselves cannot be mailed until early October. But everyone in Iowa will be receiving that request for a ballot if they'd like. And of course, you can also vote in person on Election Day on November 3rd. I'd like to share with you a key principle that helps guide our legislative work. And you'll be able to see all of this information in some documents that the bishops are putting together and should be available probably starting next week. The dignity of the human person is the foundation of our moral vision for society. When we talk about the dignity of a person, we're not talking about whether they're dressed nice or if they have good manners. We are recognizing that each person is created in the image and likeness of God. Our lives are all equal in that way. So that applies to everyone, no matter our color. It applies to the unborn. It applies to people who are hurting because they believe they're a different gender than what their bodies might say. Pope Benedict said it very well. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. Tell that to a young person you know. All right, a couple things we want to talk about before we wrap it up today. One way that you can stay involved is you can be involved in the work of the Iowa Catholic Conference and receive our action alerts on important legislation. It makes it very easy to contact your lawmakers. You can text the word Iowa Catholic to 50457. So you're going to want to take another, maybe even want to write down that number. The place that you want to send that to is 50457, and you want to text the word Iowa Catholic to that place, okay? And that way you'll get on our email list, and you'll be able to, or text list, and you'll be able to get our text messages when we send those out. You can also sign up for our legislative network at iowacatholicconference.org. If you go there to that website, and in the upper right, there's a place to sign up, and that means you'll receive our regular newsletter, and you'll also receive action alerts in that way. And that's the best way that you could really stay in touch with the work that we're doing on behalf of the bishops. And then one final reflection question. What will you do to help your family, friends, or faith community participate in public life guided by the values of our faith? I think each of us can take some time to figure out what we can do with the people around us. I know it's kind of a weird time with the pandemic and you're not seeing as many people in person as possible. Some of you might be social media influencers in some way within your own networks, and that's one way that you can figure out how to help others get involved in the political process. So at this point, I'd be very happy to take questions. Any concerns people have, you can put them in the chat box or just ask them, and I'm happy to answer a lot of questions before we go.
Tom, just real quick before we open it wide open, I was going to text the 50457 to everybody, or send it through the chat. Is Iowa Catholic two separate words or all together?
One word. Just keep the one word together, Iowa Catholic.
Okay, thanks.
And that'll take you to the link. Yep.
Okay, so anybody have questions for Tom or thoughts? Okay, Barb?
Tom, we get letters to the editor now, and one of them was a woman who emailed that, and she quoted a priest who was saying that you cannot vote for a candidate who supports abortion, and was very, I mean, it got made points about what would happen if you did vote for a person who supports abortion. I mean, this seems to go every political season, and I told her we couldn't run that. And she said, I can't believe that a diocesan newspaper wouldn't allow us to run something like that. So I'm not, I told her I appreciated the other part of her letter and I'd be willing to run that, and that wasn't acceptable to her. So I just am wondering, how do, we talk about this polarization, but what can we do about something like that?
Well, of course, that comes up all the time. Every election cycle, you will see priests, announce something like that, or sometimes even bishops kind of get into that area. Certainly from the perspective of the bishops of Iowa and the national documents that I've seen, you really have to use your conscience to decide how to vote. Now, if you were to vote for a candidate because of their pro-abortion or pro-choice stance, that would be wrong. I mean, that's objectively wrong. But the bishops have said that you may vote for another candidate for, basically very grave reasons otherwise, if they do not hold that position. So it would not be correct to say that the church demands that you vote for a particular candidate with a particular position. Now, if I, as an individual, want to hold that position, that would be, fair game for me as an individual. If that's the position I wanted to hold, and that's what I arrived at my conscience, that would be fine. Also, as we didn't get into a lot today, but we could have, is that the bishops definitely encourage lay people to get involved in the political process. And so that means lay people might organize themselves to get involved in the political process. And those groups, of course, could hold the positions that they come to. But it would not be correct to say that that's what the bishops are teaching as having to be the position of the church. And so that makes it very difficult and comes up a lot. And it's not the answer that people always want to hear, but I think we need to be accurate in what the bishops are trying to get across. I don't know if that answered your question, Barb, or...
Well, I think that the hard thing is she wanted to quote a priest, although it was an unnamed priest.
Right.
And that seems to give it more weight. If you hear that a priest is saying that, I think some people would say, well, that's authoritative.
Right, right. And I think we should listen to our priests, but at the same time, they don't always speak for the whole church, in their political opinions.
Tom, we have had kind of a follow-up to that. Someone would like you to clarify the kind of discernment that might lead someone to vote for a pro-abortion candidate.
Yeah, that's a great question. You'd have to look at the principles, for example, that we just talked about that the Iowa bishops were considering. Obviously, a respect for life needs to be first and foremost, but that's not the only thing we look at. We want to have leaders who are competent. We want to have leaders who look out for other vulnerable groups and people. Those are all principles that you'll see in the document coming out from the bishops. So in some sense, I can see that might lead some people to look in some different directions. Obviously, racism is something that is a very key issue and can never be right. So it makes it difficult for people to make those choices, but I think that's how you would see some people leading themselves to do that. And I think another principle that I think is important for church leadership is we have to be careful about teaching that people should follow their conscience and really do a diligent job in that. And then when they do that, objectively, they try to do that and they come to maybe a different conclusion than other people. We should be careful about criticizing people and telling them they're wrong. I do see a question in the chat box that came to me. Basically, it would seem like faithful citizenship is more than just a matter for election day. And is that right? And I would say certainly it's much more than just something for election day. And I would say election day is actually only a very small part of it. Unfortunately, this is the time of year when people pay attention to our political involvement because we do have an election day coming up. But that's the least of what we would do, I would say, because your vote for a particular candidate is very attenuated in terms of what it will accomplish. You may vote for a particular candidate because you like this fundamental principle they have. Well, how much effect are they really going to have on that, even at the state level? it makes it difficult, to say that this is what I'm going to accomplish through my vote. And that's why it's so difficult to make that decision. But I would say much more important is getting involved, after Election Day. Make sure you reach out to your legislators and candidates. They're very willing, I have found, the vast majority of election candidates and legislators themselves are very willing to meet with you or a small group of people about a particular issue, even if they're not agreeing with you, you think, on that issue. Most politicians get into the business because they want to help people. And so we should never hesitate reaching out to them on anything that we think is important. And that's one of the advantages if you sign up for our newsletter and our action alerts, is we make it very easy for you to put your address in, and then you can send a message directly to your legislator. And there's no better way really to contact them. If we get into personal meetings this fall or at the Capitol, that would be great if you want to meet with them personally when it's time to do that. But yeah, really organizing yourself with others who are interested in the same issues, it's very important. And I probably put less focus on Election Day than almost anybody else in the political arena. It's certainly true. Another point that was made to me is that the bishop does have staff who helps with these efforts. So I know certainly in the Diocese of Davenport, you have a wonderful opportunity with many volunteers that help out in the social action office, like you, Amy, and others who do the work. People can always contact you for more information. I know you guys do a great job of putting information out from the 4 bishops. And so that is one way that people can stay involved. I also really think it's super important for people to organize themselves, because I have found in my experience at the Catholic Conference, there's very little that we can accomplish without joining together alongside other groups of people. And so it's very important for you to build coalitions at the local level that can work together on all these issues. And sometimes, that's the only issue that you'll work together on, but it can be very critical in getting to something that would be a successful, successful outcome at the legislature.
Loxie, do you have your hand up? Nope. Okay.
I do have another question. Could I speak to what the USCCB meant when they said the threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority? I think what they meant by that is abortion is a life and death issue. There's no way about it. Abortion, no two ways about it. Abortion is a life and death issue. And then, so that's why that's always going to be a priority for the bishops at the federal level and for the bishops in Iowa. One of the things that we've worked on over the past couple of years, talked about even before that, is to work on a constitutional amendment, which would just say that the Iowa Constitution does not contain a right to an abortion. And that's something that we really need to have here, because our Iowa Supreme Court found a fundamental right to abortion in the state constitution. And so that's always going to be a priority that we're working on. I see another comment that talks about how pro-life means not being only anti-abortion, but it should also include fighting against racism, homelessness, low income, capital punishment, etc. And of course, that's true. I'm a big believer that the Catholic Church is a big enough organization with a lot of interested people that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Not every person is going to be interested in every issue. I think we all need to come from those principles. And in my experience in the Catholic Church, doing these presentations over the past, 12 to 15 years, almost no one would disagree with the principles that we talk about. I mean, everyone agrees that, abortion's a big issue, racism's a big issue, poverty's an issue. It's just a question of how that plays out in the political arena and what weight do you want to put on it as you work on it. And so I invite people to pick your issue, understand what the fundamentals are. If you want to work on abortion, we got plenty of work for you to do at the Capitol on that. If you're interested on mental health funding, we work on that as well. Doesn't mean that any particular thing is more important than the other or lesser. I mean, we know life and death things are important, but these other things are issues of concern as well.
So, Tom, people are kind of struggling with this particular, area, the questions of, okay, abortion, there's other things. And I mean, there's the paragraph that really kind of, it talks about all this stuff that, that you've been mentioning, but it kind of gets to the heart of it is in the document, Faithful Citizenship. It's paragraph 34. And this is what it says. And these are the bishops trying to be very careful in their language and, and parse it out. But so here it says, Catholics often face difficult choices about how to vote. This is why it is so important to vote according to a well-formed conscience that perceives the proper relationship among moral goods. A Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who takes a position in favor of an intrinsic evil, such as abortion or racism, if the voter's intent is to support that position. In such cases, a Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in great evil. At the same time, a voter should not use a candidate's opposition to an intrinsic evil to justify indifference or inattentiveness to other important moral issues involving human life and dignity. So that kind of, it's something to pray with, and reflect on. It gives us a framework for that. I think that's really helpful, for me anyway.
Yeah, and you can find that document as well as many other resources at faithfulcitizenship.org. That's the U.S. Bishop's website for this document, and you can go to faithfulcitizenship.org to read the whole thing. And actually, I would love it if you did. I've seen the polls asking Catholics, well, how many of you have read the Faithful Citizenship document? It's not a super high percentage, but the people on this call are really interested in it. And so I would advise you go back and read the whole thing. The question has come up is, when is the Iowa Bishop's material going to be ready? Actually, the text of the material is ready. We have it at our designer, to make the final flyers ready to go. And so I anticipate that it will be on our website, iowacatholicconference.org, and sent out to the dioceses probably next week, I would think.
There's also, it's a long document, but it is excellent. People really should, but there's also, since people don't have, the attention span for that kind of a thing, and they reach maybe a younger audience as well, there's some videos that the bishops put out. They're short. There's like 5 main videos that deal with different subject matters that are really, I think, quite good.
Yep, and it's all available on that website, on that link. And I'll put that in the chat as well.
Barb?
So Tom, just to clarify, so we had planned on doing kind of a feature on faithful citizenship for next week's paper, but that might be if the materials aren't out until next week, then we wouldn't be able to do that. I'd like to have those materials. Do you think they'd be ready? They're not going to be ready at the end of the week, or?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
It's off to the designer. They're working on it right now. I may have it as soon as tomorrow.
Okay.
But I'll make sure I get it to the diocesan communications people as soon as possible.
Okay.
We're going to make our push as soon as you have that out and Barb is putting it in the paper. Then we're going to put all our stuff on the website and kind of put it out there to the parishes and things. The USCCB things, ICC, all our stuff.
Yeah, and one more comment I would make, and before we see if there's any more questions, is that the whole idea of civilize it, I think, is equally as important within the Catholic community as without, because we have to give ourselves some room to disagree on some of these, specific issues. We've got to agree on the principles, but specifically, how does that work out? We've got to give ourselves room to keep talking as a Catholic community. It's difficult. People will have strong positions, and I support people in those positions if they've arrived to them, through that process. So definitely would encourage you to look at the Civilize It material as well.
I think, Tom, one of the things that you said that really stood out to me is that we should always assume the best intentions of people we're interacting with. Like you said, that they have a lived experience, they have come to feel a certain way legitimately, and we need to be respectful of that. We don't have to agree, but we do need to be respectful of it.
Yeah, and I think there's also a piece where people make mistakes as well. And even we see that in government, is that if government screws up, and they do, you know, it's not because necessarily bad faith or trying to do one thing or another. It's just they made a screw up, you know. And we all know in the church and otherwise, we all have our own screw ups that we want to make sure we give people some room to do that and say they're sorry. But yeah, it's this can be a very difficult process. I'm interested, you know, actually this fall among the Catholic community, sometimes it can get pretty rough in a parish. Now, is that going to look different with the COVID situation and not so many people maybe around the institution? Are we going to lose our, you know, impact with people that way? I think we've got a lot to think about. One more question I see is it difficult to get people to engage even with an invitation, or saying it is difficult? Do I have any suggestions? Well, I think the invitation has to be gentle. One of the things that we try to do when we do these presentations in parishes is to try to make that invitation, make sure people understand that we're coming from a certain perspective, and we want to talk about some principles, and we'll have some discussion about it. And oftentimes what has happened is that you get all of the hardcore Republicans and all of the hardcore Democrats who turn out. You know, you really don't get that person who's really trying to make their way through it. And we have to say tough things to both parties sometimes, and we have to be willing to do that. But as best we can, we need to invite people with an understanding that, you know, we're talking about a process that's not really about Election Day. It's about much more than that. And I think that can help if you can get that across.
Other questions? Tom?
Yeah, Tom, could you comment on how we should understand Archbishop Dolan's appearance at the Republican National Convention?
Yeah, my feeling is, and I certainly would live that out with the bishops in Iowa, is that virtually any time that you know, politicians would want you to engage and be able to engage with your own message, I would encourage that. Now, there are always politicians who want to make a point and try to use you and that sort of thing. But part of what we need to do as individuals in our society is try to engage as much as possible with you know, candidates for office and legislators. And so when invitations like that come, it's like the Cardinal said. He said, I would be glad to speak at the Democratic Convention and provide prayer just as much as the Republican Convention. So in that sense, I think that was, it's a good outreach. There were also priests who spoke at the Democratic Convention. I think that's a good outreach because they need to hear from us. Because if we just say, well, we're not going to engage with you because we don't like what you're doing, they never hear that other perspective, and we have to be willing to say that perspective. Sure, go ahead, Tom.
Quick follow-up. You know, I probably had the opportunity to see almost every one of the candidates running for president. And in none of those sessions did I see any priest, or I saw a number of nuns involved, but I never saw anybody represented from the clergy.
That's a great point.
I mean, is that a follow-up on what you just said about?
Well, here's one of the, well, and I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I'll try to answer it. I find, generally speaking, the problem we have is priests are unwilling to address political issues in any way because they know it really causes issues in the parish, no matter what they say. It is like pulling teeth, you know, to get them to address, and I'm not shooting them down, but I think any priest who's on here knows what I'm talking about. It's difficult to do that. And so we want to provide the resources. And that's really what these resources that are going to be made available from the 4 bishops can help with, is the priest can say, here's what the bishops want to get across. And what I'm telling you is really coming from the bishops of Iowa. So I would encourage that involvement and to stand up and go to those meetings and say your piece, but I'm sure that many priests would be very not wanting to do that because they don't want to deal with the reaction to it.
You know, I make a quick follow-up, if I could. Last week's Catholic Messenger talked about and Bishop Sinclair had a recommendation that we talk about the Open Wide Our Hearts, the bishop's letter against racism. Would we expect to see something from our parish on a message on that, a sermon, a homily, or some encouragement regarding racism?
I think if you listen to the Diocese of Davenport, if they're listening to the diocese, there will be. I know that there are some efforts to get that information out there, and I'll let others talk about that. But one of the things that we're going to do at our next Human Life and Dignity Committee meeting for the Iowa Catholic Conference is really address some of the resources, even from Catholic Charities USA, to try to get that out in parishes. But I don't know if someone from the diocese would like to answer that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. All of our deaneries are talking about racism. Right? You know, there's deaneries, there's like 6 deaneries. They're all talking about it. One of them is going to talk about for the next 4 meetings, they're going to talk about it. They're talking about Open Wide Our Hearts. They've read it. They're discussing it. I've asked them to preach on racism when they have an opportunity. It's out there. We're working with it. It's outside of some people's comfort zone, and so we need to support them in speaking to that issue.
In addition, the Social Action Office offered a training on how to lead small group studies of Open Wide Our Hearts, and we're finishing up our first training this evening. We've had priests, deacons, and lay people participating, and the idea is then that they will go back to their parishes and potentially lead sessions at the parish level. And I don't know when we will schedule a second training, but if there's enough interest, we would absolutely do that. Kent, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Nope. Okay.
I do have another question if you would. I don't know what your time schedule is, Amy. I had another question that came in.
Okay, and then I have another one. I'm going to go ahead and I'll copy it and get it to you so you can read it.
Okay, good. This question has to do with the repeal or if there's a different decision by the Iowa or U.S. Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade. What happens if Roe v. Wade gets struck down? Most likely, if that decision is overturned, it will probably send abortion back to the state level. But here in Iowa, that's one of the problems, is that we now have a state constitutional right to an abortion. And that's one of the things we try to get across to people, is even if Roe v. Wade would go away, which I don't think it is, but if it were to go away, we still have our state constitution to deal with, and that's why we need that amendment to the state constitution. Another question is about one of the dangers with focusing on a few issues is where we are headed as a country in the long term. Is the Constitution valid, or because it was written by flawed individuals, is it time to rewrite our Constitution? You know, that's a great question. The bishops have not engaged, specifically on that, because that, in one sense, that's the expertise of lay people rather than bishops. Do we need a new Constitution? That sort of thing. Great question. I know there's that talk out there. And that's something that, maybe people feel like there is a need for a new one, but that's not something we've got involved in.
Tom, I would just like to follow up also on something else you said, which is for people to get involved, but to get involved while organizing with others, that there's a lot of power in joining voices together. I know that at the state capitol, they have different days where people who have interest in a particular topic can arrange to come there. we have a couple of Google groups at the diocese that people are welcome to sign up for, and we put out information about different calls to action or opportunities to learn about issues. And if we knew that there was interest in a particular topic, we would be more than happy to provide support to anybody who was trying to put things together. We've got a couple of people in the office, more than a couple, who have significant experience in organizing and pulling groups together, and would be willing to offer their expertise. So, and to that end, just quick plug for the next Lunch and Learn. Our October 1st Lunch and Learn, we'll be hearing from Rural Voices, where we're hoping to just have a greater understanding of the issues of concern to members of our diocese who are living in the towns and on the farms in the rural areas. And then in November, it's tentatively titled, What, So What, Now What? Because our Lunch and Learn will follow the election, so we'll have an idea of who our new representatives are, and it'll be a really good time to talk about, okay, what are the issues of particular interest? What can we be studying on? How can we start contacting them and making them aware of our positions on it? So like Tom said, I agree with you 100%. Election day is critical, but I'm not sure that it's any more critical than the work that we do throughout the year to try to influence our legislators.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Just scanning to see if we have anybody else who had a question.
I had another note that asks about writing that speaks to what a Catholic politician would look like. One that is not necessarily following party lines, but looking to represent Catholic teaching and public service. That is a great point. One place I would point you towards is the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. There's a section in that document that relates to what leaders should look like. And it's not something we talked about today, but I think there's a pretty good section on what leaders should look like. There's some other resources out there as well. And this is the challenge of our time for Catholic politicians. And I've seen it many times, Catholic politicians maybe are pro-life and they go into public service, and then they turn out that they're not pro-life anymore because they can't get elected that way. It's a horrible thing to see. And that's why I think it's so important. And we are seeing some movement towards this now in some areas where, groups of Catholics who are lay people, not bishops, really do try to support Catholics who are running for office. I really think we need that. We need people of good conscience in both parties to run for office, and we need them to be able to be the people they are and that they can be. And so that's one thing I've given a lot of thought about. I don't have a lot of answers on, but it's something that I think we need to unlock that at some point. What was that appendum to? It's called the Catholic Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. So if you do a web search for Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, you will find that document. And actually, the whole book is online if you want to search it that way.
Scanning to see if there's.
That's all I got.
I will put together a follow-up email with some resources, some of the information that Tom has pointed to. I believe that you were also going to provide a copy of your slideshow, Tom.
Oh yeah, you bet.
Okay, but
I'll send that to you.
That's great for anyone, and I will pull a few of those links that you specifically addressed out and put those in the email. And then, as I said, if this will be recorded, and as soon as I know where that's going to be located, I'll let you all know too. I want to thank everybody. Tom, thank you so much.
Sure.
I really appreciate your willingness to be present here and to share your expertise. It's great to hear somebody speaking from their faith. So thank you all for joining, and be watching for the next few Lunch and Learns, and hope to see some of you there. Thank you.